So picking up from the last lecture on Louis XIV and absolutism, I now want to talk about the other form of strong central government, which is constitutionalism. This was a system of government that was pioneered in England, where power would be shared between the king and parliament. Parliament represented the people. Parliament made the laws, the king enforced the laws. And the idea was they were supposed to share this power. This was the theory, and Parliament had been around in England for a number of years, hundreds of years, in fact. However, there had always been a power struggle between king and Parliament over who had ultimate authority. And beginning in the early 1600s, the kings of the Stuart family, James I and Charles I, sought to drastically expand their power and become absolute monarchs. They failed. Why did they fail? They failed because they had a number of enemies which their behavior convinced to come together and would eventually overthrow the kings of England and establish Parliament's supremacy and ultimately the English constitutional form of government, of balanced government between king and Parliament, checks and balances. So who were these enemies? First of all, Parliament. The wealthy English landlords of Parliament were accustomed to being consulted on raising taxes, on passing laws. But the Stuart kings hoped to summon Parliament rarely to collect funds. Instead, they resorted to levying taxes without parliamentary consent, essentially raising money illegally, which frustrated, infuriated Parliament. The other enemies they had were the Puritans. The Puritans were believers that Catholicism was an evil religion and that England must be cured of all forms of Catholicism. However, the Stuart kings were not anti-Catholic. James I wanted peaceful relations with Roman Catholic Spain and France, and his son Charles I married a Catholic and wanted Anglicanism to resemble Catholicism, Anglicanism being the official Church of England. And he, Charles I, persecuted Puritan ministers that resisted his religious policies. And so Charles I was quite good at unifying his parliamentary and Puritan enemies. And here is a picture of Charles I, not as regal looking as the portrait of Louis XIV that I showed you in the previous lecture. This tension eventually led to civil war between king and parliament. The trigger for the civil war was that Charles I called on Parliament and demanded taxes be raised for a war he wanted to fight with the neighboring country of Scotland. Parliament was willing to pass these taxes, but they wanted something in return. They wanted to be called every 3 years, and not only when the king wanted. They wanted a full partnership with the king. Charles wouldn't have any of this, and in 1642 he and his forces invaded Parliament, seeking to crush parliamentary opposition. Thus the Civil War breaks out, which lasts between 1642 and 46. In this war, Parliament and the Puritans unite and defeat the king and his forces by 1646. What happens next is a consequence of the war and its radicalization. Having challenged the authority of the king, virtually anything was on the table in the future, and now divisions developed between the victors. Parliament was filled with moderate Protestants who were interested in negotiating a peace quickly with Charles, having the monarchy still in existence, and maintaining the checks and balances that they tried to have before. The army, however, was filled with Puritan radicals who wanted the elimination of the monarchy, the elimination of the Anglican Church of England, and the imposition of Puritan religious and social ideas. In 1648, the army purged Parliament of its moderate members. Those that were left over, or the Rump Parliament in 1649, voted after they tried Charles I. They found him guilty of treason, and they executed him, and they abolished the monarchy, and they also abolished the Church of England. Thereafter, England is a republic. It is ruled by Oliver Cromwell, the Puritan and head of the army. England became increasingly dictatorial under this military rule. Cromwell disbanded Parliament. He imposed taxes on his own to pay for his wars, and he imposed censorship to crush all political opposition. He died in 1658, and after that period of military dictatorship, most English wanted a return to monarchy with Parliament as its check. Charles II was brought back as the King of England, the son of Charles I. Parliament was brought back, but the old problems returned. Parliament was again dominated by Anglicans, while Protestant and moderate Protestants, many of them, they resisted any move towards Catholicism. But Charles II, just like his father, favored a more tolerant relationship with Catholics at home and abroad. Specifically, Charles wanted to give Catholics freedom to practice their faith in England. Charles also sought to mimic the absolutism of Louis XIV. He tried to raise money without going to Parliament, and he did so through a loan from the French king, Louis XIV. So again, Charles II upset his religious and his political enemies, but not enough to lead to a civil war. His son, however, James II, was much more extreme in his points of views. He was openly Roman Catholic. He gave Catholics full religious toleration to practice their faith, and he ignored Parliament. This unified James's religious and political enemies, and it led to, and here's a picture of James. Notice that he looks like the warrior, like Louis XIV, the absolute king he tries to be like. It led to the Glorious Revolution of 1688. In that year, James II had a male child who was going to be the next king, and he was baptized a Catholic. Protestants throughout the country feared the establishment of a Catholic dynasty, and so Parliament took it upon themselves to find a replacement. They invited Prince William of Orange, ruler of Holland, to invade England, to become England's king. They invited him because he was married to James's daughter, Mary, a Protestant. When William invaded England, he was received without opposition. James II fled to France, and William and Mary are the new monarchs of England. To do so, however, Parliament insisted that they sign two laws before they would be recognized as king and queen: the 1689 English Bill of Rights and the Toleration Act. The Bill of Rights limited the king's authority, protected civil rights, and barred Catholics from the throne. The Toleration Act made it clear, both of these laws together. The first, the Bill of Rights, limited the king's authority and protected civil rights. The Toleration Act barred Catholics from the throne. The Toleration Act also made it free for all Protestants to worship, regardless of Anglican or Methodist or Baptist or Puritan, but not the Catholics. These two laws established political stability in England for generations to come, and it's this idea of checks and balances, king and parliament working together, which was then transferred to America, when English colonists went to America through the 1600s and into the 1700s.